At the end of the 19th century, as the United States stood intoxicated by industrialization and a new tide of economic power rose with irresistible force, there was one man standing at the edge of the very dynasty into which he had been born. He was not the wealthiest, nor the most ruthlessly power-hungry member of his family. Yet he would become the man who left behind the most ambitious creation of them all, and the deepest crack in the myth of America's everlasting wealth. His name was George Vanderbilt. Born beneath the vast shadow of the Vanderbilt family, where fortunes were measured in railroads, stock holdings, and political influence, George grew up surrounded by cold calculations and relentless negotiations. Unlike his relatives, however, he was not seduced by rapid expansion or short-term profit. George Vanderbilt was a man of books, of libraries, of long journeys through Europe, where he became captivated by ancient French chateaux and English country estates, places built not merely to display power, but to endure across centuries. It was there that an idea began to take shape. Not a house, but a declaration. Not a comfortable residence, but a symbol. George Vanderbilt did not want something resembling the lavish summer mansions rising across Newport or Long Island. He wanted more than that. He wanted a self-contained world, a private dominion where knowledge, art, agriculture, and personal authority could coexist within an order he believed would never collapse. And so he chose a remote land, far removed from the traditional centers of power in the Northeast. In the rolling green hills of Asheville, amid the still untamed Blue Ridge Mountains, George Vanderbilt began purchasing parcels of land quietly but relentlessly. In less than a decade, he amassed more than 125,000 acres, creating a private territory of unprecedented scale in the history of American estates. It was here that Biltmore Estate was conceived, a structure not designed to blend into the landscape, but to dominate it. George Vanderbilt hired Richard Morris Hunt, the leading architect of the Gilded Age, educated at the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Hunt was not asked to economize, nor constrained by scale. His task was to create a French-style palace on American soil, cold, precise, and uncompromising in its Renaissance architectural language. Thousands of laborers were brought into the mountains. A private railroad line was built solely to transport materials. Limestone was quarried on site, while rare timber was shipped in from across the nation. Massive stone blocks were carved by hand. Every sculpted detail, every window frame, every arch bore the mark of an ambition without limit. Yet behind this splendor, a quiet question began to form, one no one yet dared to speak aloud. Could a dream built upon the assumption of infinite wealth truly endure? Or was it merely postponing an inevitable collapse? George Vanderbilt believed that knowledge, culture, and control of land would shield him from the turbulence of history. But history is rarely kind to such absolute faith. When Biltmore was officially completed in 1895, it was not only the largest private residence in the United States, it was a defiant declaration aimed at the nation itself. And yet, in that very moment, as the monumental doors closed after the opening celebration, history's clock had already begun to count down. George Vanderbilt's ambition had reached its summit, but the true cost of that ambition remained hidden, waiting patiently to be revealed. When the massive iron gates of Biltmore Estate officially opened in the winter of 1895, the outside world saw only an architectural marvel. But inside, what truly powered Biltmore was not limestone, nor the European art delivered by private rail lines. It was a vast, intricate, and enormously expensive machine, one that demanded daily nourishment in the form of money, labor, and absolute control. Biltmore was never designed to function as an ordinary home. It was a closed ecosystem, where every cutting-edge convenience of the late 19th century operated simultaneously. A private electrical system, central heating, elevators, refrigeration rooms, industrial laundries, kitchens capable of serving hundreds, and an underground network of corridors that allowed servants to move unseen. Every detail reflected George Vanderbilt's deep belief that perfect order could be sustained as long as everything remained under control. But control came at a cost. And at Biltmore, that cost was paid through the labor of hundreds of people living and working behind cold stone walls. Servants, cooks, butlers, mechanics, gardeners, and maintenance staff ran the estate like a miniature city. Their lives were governed by shifts, bells, and schedules so rigid that randomness had no place. To invited guests, Biltmore appeared flawlessly magnificent. To those who kept it running, it was a wheel that was never allowed to stop. George Vanderbilt was not a tyrant in the traditional sense. He was often described as calm, courteous, and deeply educated. Yet it was precisely this emotional distance that prevented him from recognizing how quickly Biltmore was consuming wealth, at a pace even a family as rich as the Vanderbilts could not sustain forever. There was no direct source of income large enough to offset the immense operating costs. The estate did not generate profit. It simply existed and demanded to be fed. The Biltmore Library, holding more than 20,000 volumes, became the place where George Vanderbilt spent much of his time. He read European history, philosophy, natural science, and political economy. But a bitter paradox was quietly forming. While he studied the decline of old dynasties on the page, he was recreating the very conditions of that decline in real life. Luxury, when separated from the ability to sustain itself, always carries the seeds of instability. Beyond the main house, Vanderbilt invested heavily in scientific agriculture. He hired leading forestry and agricultural experts to transform tens of thousands of acres into a model of sustainable land management. Ideologically, this was a vision far ahead of its time. Financially, however, it became yet another expense added to an already growing list. The forests were carefully managed, the experimental farms meticulously operated, but the returns were modest compared to the costs. In the early years, income from family trusts and inherited assets was still sufficient to conceal the fractures. But the world beyond Biltmore's stone walls was changing far faster than the estate itself. As America entered the 20th century, economic, social, and political upheavals emerged that no private estate could fully escape. Rising land taxes, increasing labor costs, and the gradual decline of individual plutocratic power began pressing against structures once thought invulnerable. During this period, Biltmore remained radiant. Lavish receptions continued. Dinner parties stretched for hours beneath shimmering electric lights. Yet beneath the surface, the imbalance between ambition and reality was becoming increasingly visible. George Vanderbilt was not ready to acknowledge it. Perhaps he believed he would always have time to adjust. History, once again, was preparing to demonstrate that time never favors monuments built on absolute faith in the endlessness of money. As the 20th century began, Biltmore Estate appeared, on the surface, to have reached a state of equilibrium. The luxury machine still ran. The gardens were trimmed to perfection. The library remained hushed beneath warm electric light, and George Vanderbilt continued to believe that the order he had built would endure for generations. Yet, within this seemingly calm period, decisive changes began to seep into his personal life, quietly undermining both the emotional and financial foundations of the estate. In 1898, George Vanderbilt married Edith Vanderbilt, a woman intelligent, practical, and far more instinctively attuned to management than her husband. This marriage was not merely a personal union. It marked the first time Biltmore had an owner who truly cared about its long-term viability. Edith quickly recognized what George had avoided for years. The estate was magnificent, but it was bleeding money in silence. Edith did not share her husband's romantic fascination with European architecture. She was concerned with people, with daily rhythms, and with whether a family empire could survive in a rapidly changing America. Under her influence, Biltmore began to undergo small but telling adjustments. Spending was monitored more closely. Certain lavish rituals were quietly reduced. These measures were modest, but they were the first clear signs that George Vanderbilt's original dream was being forced to confront reality. In 1900, the birth of their only child, Cornelia, brought to Biltmore a sense of continuity it had never known. In that moment, George believed he was no longer building for himself alone, but for a long family future. Yet this new responsibility sharpened a troubling question. Was an immense but unprofitable inheritance truly a gift or a burden passed from one generation to the next? Beyond the stone walls, America was entering a period of profound instability. Progressive reforms, antitrust laws, and shifting attitudes toward the power of industrial elites began to erode the social foundations that had once protected families like the Vanderbilts. When the First World War erupted, the old order George admired in Europe collapsed before his eyes. Royal empires disintegrated. Palaces once considered eternal became unsustainable liabilities. War was not merely a political rupture. It fundamentally altered the relationship between the individual and the state, between private wealth and public obligation. Taxes rose, labor grew more expensive, privileges once extended to the ultra-wealthy narrowed. Biltmore, already difficult to maintain, became increasingly fragile. George Vanderbilt, a man who had devoted his life to building a world apart, began to understand that no estate could remain outside of history. His health declined rapidly during the war years. European travel ceased. Hours in the library grew quieter, more somber, stripped of earlier dreams. George Vanderbilt died in 1914, just before the old world he revered collapsed completely. His death did not merely close one life, it marked the end of an era in which Biltmore had been sustained by pure faith in the endlessness of wealth. When George was gone, Biltmore still stood vast and resplendent. But for the first time since the very first stone was laid, the estate no longer had its creator to defend it with personal belief alone. The responsibility now rested with Edith Vanderbilt in a world utterly unlike the one her husband had imagined. And the decisions she would be forced to make would change Biltmore forever. After the death of George Vanderbilt, Biltmore Estate entered the most dangerous period in its history. Its creator was gone. The absolute belief that had once bound the vast structure together had vanished. For the first time, the estate was forced to confront a question long avoided. Was Biltmore a legacy to be preserved, or a burden that would need to be dismantled piece by piece in order to survive? That responsibility fell entirely upon Edith Vanderbilt. She did not approach Biltmore as a symbol to be worshipped, but as a living organism in crisis, one that could only be saved through painful decisions. Unlike her husband, Edith understood that sentiment could not pay bills, and in a rapidly changing post-war America, there was no longer room for estates sustained by the memories of a vanished century. The years following 1914 became a continuous process of reduction. The servant staff was cut back, lavish rituals were eliminated, rooms once dedicated solely to display were quietly closed. Edith was forced to convert large portions of the land into income-producing assets, selling off peripheral tracts to reduce taxes and management costs. Each decision eroded George Vanderbilt's original vision, yet each one also pulled Biltmore back from the edge of immediate collapse. One of the most consequential changes was the decision to open Biltmore to the public, an unthinkable idea during George Vanderbilt's lifetime. This step did more than generate new revenue. It marked a symbolic shift. Biltmore was no longer the private dominion of an individual, but a semi-public space where history itself was offered in exchange for survival. In that moment, the isolation George had once cherished was lost, but Biltmore gained a chance to exist in an era that no longer favored extravagant fortresses. At the same time, Edith continued and expanded the estate's agricultural and forestry programs, building upon the scientific foundations George had initiated with early guidance from Frederick Law Olmsted. Forests were managed sustainably. Farms were reorganized with a more pragmatic focus. These were no longer idealistic experiments, but acts of survival. Every preserved forest, every efficiently cultivated field became another breath of life extended for the estate. Then came the Great Depression. For many estates across America, it marked the end. Mansions were abandoned, properties seized, and the grand symbols of the Gilded Age reduced to ruins. Biltmore did not collapse thanks largely to Edith's early, unsentimental decisions. But it did not remain whole either. Its survival was a bitter victory, purchased at the cost of surrendering the illusion of permanence. Edith Vanderbilt died in 1958, leaving behind a fundamentally transformed Biltmore. It was still vast, still beautiful, but it was no longer the embodiment of its original dream. No longer a monument to absolute private power, Biltmore had become evidence of a harsh historical lesson. Ambition, when it exceeds the capacity to sustain itself, is ultimately forced to yield to reality. The stone walls of Biltmore still stand silent and imposing. Yet for those who listen closely, they echo with the weight of choices made in desperation, of dreams deliberately reduced in order to survive. And it is within that compromise that the true story of Biltmore begins its final chapter. After Edith Vanderbilt passed away, Biltmore Estate was no longer a family asset in the traditional sense. It became an open historical equation. The heirs face an unavoidable reality. Either Biltmore would find a way to sustain itself in the modern world, or it would become a dead monument preserved by nostalgia, yet steadily eroded by cost and time. In post-World War II America, as society turned decisively toward the future, structures rooted in the Gilded Age were forced to redefine their purpose. The decisive life or death choice was to transform Biltmore from a family symbol into an institution operating according to public logic and market realities. Guided tours were expanded, no longer serving merely as voyeuristic glimpses into the lives of the ultra-wealthy, but as carefully structured educational experiences. History, architecture, art, and even the financial misjudgments of the past were presented as a single, coherent narrative, neither concealed nor romanticized. It was this honesty that allowed Biltmore to find a new voice among generations no longer captivated by spectacle alone. In its effort to become self-sustaining, Biltmore began to draw value from what had once been considered secondary. The sustainably managed forest became a steady source of income and a model for modern forestry. The experimental farms, once the academic passion of George Vanderbilt, were reorganized along more pragmatic economic lines. Vineyards and a winery were developed not merely as commercial ventures, but as a continuation of the story of land and human stewardship. At the same time, preservation entered a new phase. No longer an effort to freeze everything at any cost, conservation at Biltmore became the art of selection. Areas of core historical value received rigorous investment. Other spaces were adapted to meet contemporary needs without shattering the whole. Each decision acknowledged an uncomfortable truth. Heritage survives only by accepting change, and change is always accompanied by loss. In its new role, Biltmore became a mirror of American history itself. It tells a story of personal ambition fueled by immense wealth, of the belief that beauty and knowledge could stand apart from economic law, and of the moment when history forces its limits upon human aspiration. Visitors do not merely enter a castle. They enter a dialogue between past and present, where the question is not how grand Biltmore once was, but what it had to surrender in order to endure. As the 20th century drew to a close, Biltmore still stood not as a fortress of private power, but as a living historical organism, continually adapting. Its survival no longer rests on blind faith in endless money, but on the capacity to tell an honest story about those very limits. And within that honesty, the unretracted ambition of George Vanderbilt finally found the only form of existence possible in the modern age, not as an intact dream, but as a preserved lesson. As Biltmore Estate entered its new role in the second half of the 20th century, the question was no longer how to sustain luxury, but how to preserve memory without turning it into an empty stage. Biltmore now lived within a prolonged paradox. It required visitors in order to survive, yet every footstep slowly eroded the very stillness it once embodied. Preservation was no longer an act of freezing time, but a continuous sequence of decisions between loss and survival. Major restorations unfolded quietly, without the spectacle of the grand soirees of the past. Roofs had to be reinforced, mechanical and electrical systems replaced. Paintings and carved wood required tightly controlled climates to keep time from consuming them. Each conservation project became a negotiation with history. How much could be kept? How much had to be replaced without betraying the original spirit? These questions offered no final answers, only choices that were less damaging than the alternatives. Within this process, the image of George Vanderbilt was gradually re-examined. He came to be seen not merely as a wealthy man who built a large house, but as a defining figure of the Gilded Age in all its contradictions. His devotion to knowledge and art was genuine. Equally real, however, was his belief that money could construct a world insulated from social laws. In the 21st century, Biltmore became a place to confront that contradiction rather than conceal it. As American society evolved, so too did its approach to heritage. Visitors no longer sought beauty alone, they sought story. They wanted to know who lived here, who labored unseen in underground corridors, and what the true cost of splendor had been. Biltmore was compelled to open layers of memory long ignored. The histories of servants, of local laborers, of lands sold off to pay debts were gradually woven into the broader narrative. Heritage ceased to be a monologue of power and became a chorus of many lives. That honesty, however, brought a new kind of pressure. Once everything was exposed, Biltmore could no longer exist merely as a beautiful symbol. It became a reminder of an era in which inequality and personal ambition were normalized beneath a veneer of refinement. Some view this as educational value. Others see it as a moral burden no architectural monument should be asked to carry. That debate has never ended, and perhaps never will. On quiet winter days, when fog settles over the Blue Ridge Mountains and the main house returns to a rare stillness, Biltmore comes closest to itself. Not as the palace of a perfect dream, but as a silent witness to history. The stone walls once built to defy time now perform a humbler task. They hold the memory of ambition, of limits, and of the truth that no structure is immune to the consequences of its own making. In that silence, Biltmore seems to whisper an uncomfortable but necessary message. Ambition can produce extraordinary beauty, But that beauty always carries a long-term invoice. And sooner or later, history will come to collect it. Each early morning, when mist still hangs over the Blue Ridge Mountains and first light brushes the cold limestone walls, Biltmore Estate appears not as a palace triumphant over time, but as a memory that continues to breathe. There is no music, no crowd, no display. What remains is a structure standing still within history, carrying every layer of meaning that more than a century has placed upon it. In its quietest moments, Biltmore no longer belongs to George Vanderbilt, nor to any single family. It belongs to a larger story, the story of America, when it first believed it could build things equal to Europe, even surpass Europe, through money and individual will alone. George Vanderbilt believed this, and in that belief, he created a masterpiece, while unintentionally revealing the deepest limits of human ambition. What sets Biltmore apart from the countless estates that vanished is not wealth, but the capacity to adapt after the original dream collapsed. Through the pragmatic decisions of Edith Vanderbilt, and through the acceptance that heritage survives only when it serves the present, Biltmore did not become a ruin. The price of that survival, however, was the surrender of the illusion of permanence. Biltmore endured not because it was too large to fail, but because it was willing to change. In the 21st century, when visitors pass through the Great Hall, they see not only the splendor of French Renaissance architecture, but the imprint of an era that believed every problem could be solved through scale. The long corridors, soaring ceilings, and excess spaces are no longer declarations of power. They are reminders of the invisible cost of building far beyond genuine human need. Biltmore thus becomes an open historical text. It does not demand admiration or condemnation. It asks questions. What happens when ambition knows no boundary? What happens when beauty is created without a plan to sustain it? And what happens when later generations are left to pay the bill for dreams they never dreamed? If George Vanderbilt were to walk through those stone doors today, he might not recognize his Biltmore. Yet it is also possible that, in the present's quiet practicality, he would recognize the only form of existence his dream could ultimately take. Not as an impregnable fortress, but as a memory preserved through honesty. That is Biltmore's final legacy. Not a hymn to wealth, but a lesson in limits. Not a symbol of victory over time, but proof that time always collects its due. The stone walls still stand, but their meaning has changed. They no longer speak of power, they speak of awareness. As the sun rises higher over the hills of North Carolina, Biltmore enters another day. Visitors will return. Stories will continue to be told. Yet beneath all those layers of interpretation, one truth remains unerasable. Ambition can build great monuments, but only humility before history allows them to endure. When the story seems to have reached its conclusion, Biltmore Estate remains exactly where it has always been, unmoving, unchanged on the map, yet constantly shifting in how it is understood. History rarely closes with a final period. It leaves behind echoes that seep into the present, compelling each generation to renegotiate the decisions of the past. Biltmore exists precisely within that echo. No one lives in the house anymore as an absolute owner. There are no sealed evenings where light burns only for a single family. In their place are scattered footsteps, lingering glances, and a contemplative silence. Within that silence, Biltmore's central question continues to resonate. What remains when ambition has reached its ultimate limit? George Vanderbilt once believed he could build a world complete enough to stand outside of history. History, instead, preserved his creation as proof of the opposite. Biltmore survived not because it overcame time, but because time forced it to adapt. Every restoration, every reinterpretation, every shift in how the story is told is a quiet acknowledgement that the original dream could not endure intact. In modern debates over preservation, Biltmore is often cited as a special case, not because it is the most beautiful, but because it confronts an ethical question. Should everything created by great wealth be preserved? Should structures born of profound inequality be protected? Or is preservation, when practiced honestly, the only way a society can remember the true cost of power? The story of Edith Vanderbilt continues to echo through those discussions. She is remembered not as the one who fulfilled the dream, but as the one who accepted breaking it in order to save what remained. In the history of American estates, few figures left their mark, not by building more, but by knowing when to stop. And it was that decision to stop that allowed Biltmore to assume a different form of existence, less dazzling, but more durable. At day's end, when sunset darkens the gray stone walls, Biltmore no longer resembles a palace. It feels more like a stone memorandum, a reminder that ambition always accelerates faster than society's capacity to sustain it. Later generations may admire it, learn from it, even enjoy its beauty, but they're also invited to reflect not on how to build bigger, but on when to stop. Biltmore, therefore, is not a closing statement on the Gilded Age, but its lingering echo, a low, resonant echo, never loud, yet persistent. It reminds us that history is never fully buried. It only waits to be heard with honesty. And as long as people continue to believe that money can purchase permanence, the stone walls of Biltmore will still have something left to say. Night descends upon Biltmore Estate in a way entirely its own. Lights are switched on, just enough to define the architectural mass, but not enough to dispel the sense of emptiness. In those hours when visitors have departed and the voice of the present recedes, Biltmore reveals its most intimate nature. It does not tell its story through words, but through continued presence, through its refusal to disappear, even as the world around it has completely changed. Here, history does not sit behind glass. It lives in the long corridors, where footsteps echo too clearly because there is no one else to share the sound. It lives in rooms once designed for display, now transformed into spaces of reflection. And it lives in the difficult, unnamed feeling Biltmore leaves in those who stand before it, a feeling that blends admiration with unease. The legacy of George Vanderbilt is often told as the story of a man devoted to books and art. That is true, but incomplete. Biltmore reveals something more complex: how a refined intellect can still fall into the illusion that beauty, if made grand enough, will protect itself from time. George's ambition was not cruel, but it was absolute. And it was precisely that absoluteness that made it fragile. Against this stands the imprint of Edith Vanderbilt, present as a necessary fracture in the narrative. She left behind no new monument, expanded no territory, created no additional symbol. Her legacy was redirection, the moment when a dream confronted reality, and reality forced that dream to shrink in order to survive. If Biltmore still exists today, it is because someone accepted that not everything must remain untouched in order to be valued. In the 21st century, Biltmore continues to be photographed, retold, and drawn into debates over preservation and inequality. It stands as an example of a question with no easy answer. Should society preserve symbols built upon vast imbalances of power, or is preservation, when practiced honestly, the only way not to forget the true cost of those symbols? Biltmore offers no conclusion. It simply keeps the question open, like a wound deliberately left unstitched. Perhaps the most striking thing about Biltmore is that it has never fully belonged to the past. Each restoration, each new interpretation, each generation of viewers adds another layer of meaning to its stone walls. History here is not buried. It accumulates. And it is that accumulation that prevents Biltmore from ever becoming neutral. It always carries moral weight, a reminder that power and beauty are rarely innocent. As darkness thickens over the Blue Ridge Mountains and Biltmore returns to its primal silence, the story closes without crescendo. There is no dramatic collapse, no tragic finale, only a prolonged endurance, steady and unresolved, like a question repeated across generations. Why do we build? What do we choose to keep? And who ultimately pays for dreams that reach beyond human limits? Biltmore remains, not as a victory, but as a warning carved in stone. When dawn touches the stone walls of Biltmore Estate, the light does not make it young again. It only sharpens what was always there, the lines set from the beginning, the decisions carved into matter. In that moment, Biltmore is no longer a backdrop for a story. It becomes the story itself, looking back at us. The coda of Biltmore is not found in how it survived, but in how it compelled history to be told honestly. George Vanderbilt built with the belief that knowledge, beauty, and scale could create permanence. That belief was not trivial, but it was not sufficient. Biltmore exists today because someone was willing to acknowledge the limits of that belief, willing to change in order to preserve what mattered most. Within that change, the role of Edith Vanderbilt becomes unmistakably clear. She is not remembered for preserving everything, but for choosing what truly needed preservation. Not limestone, not soaring ceilings, but the capacity for Biltmore to remain in dialogue with the present. It is a quiet legacy, rarely celebrated, yet decisive. Biltmore reminds us that architecture is not innocent. Every great structure carries assumptions about power, resources, and who ultimately benefits. When eras shift, those assumptions are exposed. How we respond to that exposure, by concealing it or confronting it, is what defines a true legacy. If there is anything this story asks us to carry forward, it is not advice to build smaller, nor to abandon ambition. It is a reminder that ambition requires a plan to survive itself. Without such a plan, beauty becomes a burden, and legacy turns into an inherited bill. As the camera pulls away from the long approach road and the Blue Ridge Mountains recede into the morning mist, the story closes in the way history often does not, with a final verdict, but with a pause. And within that pause, Biltmore still stands, not to be worshipped, but to be remembered correctly. If Biltmore were a colossal body of stone, then the people who lived in its shadows were the blood that kept that body alive. Behind the grandeur of Biltmore Estate existed another world rarely mentioned in promotional images, yet essential to the estate's survival. It was the world of servants, laborers, craftsmen, and local workers. Men and women who spent their lives sustaining a dream that was never theirs. From the moment the estate was completed, Biltmore was designed with a social hierarchy, engineered with almost clinical precision. Long underground corridors ran beneath the stone floors. Secondary staircases were hidden behind thick walls. Separate living quarters for staff ensured that the lives of working people unfolded beyond the sightlines of the family and their guests. Grandeur, therefore, was not created by architecture alone, but by the deliberate invisibility of hundreds of human beings. For George Vanderbilt, this order felt natural. He is not remembered as a cruel man, but he believed deeply in the European model. He admired one in which devoted service was an unquestioned element of aristocratic life. Workers at Biltmore received housing, steady wages, and a level of security uncommon in late 19th century labor. Yet that stability came at a price: silence. They were everywhere, yet never meant to be seen. A working day at Biltmore began long before dawn. Before light touched the stone towers, fires were lit in the kitchens, hearths were warmed, floors polished, and dining tables prepared for meals at which servants would never sit. The rhythm repeated day after day, indifferent to season, weather, or the great upheavals unfolding beyond the estate. While the owner read quietly in the library, entire teams labored to ensure that silence itself was preserved. Biltmore, however, did not exist in a social vacuum. Many of its workers came from Asheville and the surrounding rural communities, living in an America undergoing rapid change. Labor movements, unionization, and debates over inequality were gaining momentum. Compared to many workplaces, conditions at Biltmore could be considered favorable. Yet the contrast between the absolute luxury of the main house and the modest lives of those who served within it only sharpened the social distance the estate represented. When Edith Vanderbilt assumed control of Biltmore, the relationship between the estate and those who lived in its shadows began to shift. Staff reductions were not merely financial decisions, they were human ruptures. For many families, Biltmore was not just a workplace, but an entire community. As the estate contracted, those communities dissolved quietly, without ceremonies, without records. History, once again, chose to preserve the stone walls rather than the lives lived in their service. Only in the 21st century did these stories begin to surface. As Biltmore's historical interpretation expanded, visitors were led through kitchens, laundry rooms, and underground corridor spaces where grandeur was sustained through invisible labor. Areas once considered secondary became central to an unsettling question. Can we truly understand Biltmore if we look only at the rooms designed for its owners? In confronting those hidden lives, Biltmore reveals perhaps its most uncomfortable truth: that no monument of ambition stands alone. Every stone rests upon human effort, and every dream, no matter how refined, casts a shadow where others must live. When viewed within the full landscape of the Gilded Age, Biltmore Estate is no longer an isolated case, but a point of comparison. America once possessed hundreds of estates, palaces, and mansions, built on the same belief that wealth could freeze time. Most of them vanished, abandoned, liquidated, or quietly demolished. Biltmore's continued existence poses a central question within America's collective memory. Why did this place survive, while so many others did not? The answer is not pure beauty. Many other estates were equally magnificent. It is not scale, which more often became a liability than an advantage. Nor is it initial wealth, as families far richer than the Vanderbilts saw their fortunes dissolve. Biltmore's difference lies in the moment it accepted a change in how it would be remembered. In popular memory, places like Hearst Castle are often framed as stories of individual excess monuments to unchecked ego and power. Others, such as Linwood Hall, became symbols of abandonment, where grand architecture stands as a visible warning. Biltmore, by contrast, was redefined as a site of learning, not a space for blind admiration, but a place to understand how an era actually functioned. This distinction did not arise naturally. It was the result of deliberate interpretive choices. When Biltmore opened its doors to the public, it did not simply sell admission tickets. It sold a narrative, but one repeatedly revised, expanded, and reshaped to include corners once left in shadow. That capacity for self-critique is what allowed Biltmore to avoid the fate of becoming a frozen museum. In the 21st century, as the United States continually confronts debates over inequality, heritage, and power, Biltmore has become a reflective surface. To some, it remains a symbol of waste that cannot be justified. To others, it functions as an educational tool where difficult questions are posed through tangible space. And for many, it exists in both states at once. It is precisely this tension that keeps Biltmore from slipping into irrelevance. Notably, America's memory of Biltmore does not stand still. Each generation reinterprets it. For those who lived through the Great Depression, it represented a world of luxury that had gone too far. For the post-war generation, it became part of a broader identity of tourism and preservation. For the present generation, it serves as a starting point for conversations about what should be preserved from the past and how that preservation ought to be done. Biltmore, therefore, is more than architecture. It is a test of national memory. It forces America to confront its own legacy, not through erasure, but through direct examination. The stone walls no longer demand unquestioning reverence. They demand honesty. Within that flow of memory, Biltmore continues to exist as an anchor point. Not because it is flawless, but because it does not pretend to be. It carries the fractures of history openly, and it is those fractures that give it meaning. As the story reaches its final passage, Biltmore Estate asks for no verdict. It stands still, as it has for more than a century, and leaves time to do the rest. The stone walls do not speak, yet it is precisely their silence that compels those who face them to ask what they are truly seeing. A triumph of architecture, or a prolonged lesson about the limits of ambition. Throughout this journey, George Vanderbilt emerges not as a villain, but as a symbol of an era that believed money could substitute for history. His love of books, art, and learning was genuine. Equally genuine was the assumption on which Biltmore was built, that wealth, if large enough, would generate its own permanence. History proved otherwise. Durability does not arise from scale, but from the capacity to recalibrate when the world changes. If George Vanderbilt represents the moment when ambition reached its apex, Edith Vanderbilt represents the moment when history intervened. Her decisions were not romantic, nor easily celebrated. Yet it was precisely that pragmatism that allowed Biltmore to endure as a reminder rather than a silent ruin. In history, those who know when to stop are remembered far less than those who know how to build more. And Biltmore exposes that paradox with unusual clarity. What keeps Biltmore meaningful in the 21st century is not the splendor that remains, but its capacity to provoke dialogue. It forces us to confront difficult questions. What should be preserved from a past built on inequality? How should those stories be told without reproducing blind reverence? And can preservation, if practiced without honesty, quietly turn history into a harmless commodity? Biltmore offers no final answers. It exists as a material warning. Every generation has its own Biltmore's projects, born from the belief that resources will never run out, systems and ambitions built faster than society's ability to sustain them. When that happens, history does not collapse immediately. It waits, and then it sends the bill. Those who leave Biltmore do not carry a neatly framed lesson. What follows them is a heavier, more necessary feeling. That beauty does not exempt responsibility. That legacy is not merely what we inherit, but how we choose to tell it. And that ambition, when not tempered by humility before history, will always leave behind structures that demand explanation more than admiration. Biltmore remains not as a promise of permanence, but as a mirror. In that mirror, every era can glimpse itself alongside the question that never grows old. What are we building, and who will be left to live with its consequences?